Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Trump's bid for union votes, the new austerity among progressive organizations, and the announcement that Ibram X Kendi's Anti-Racist Center is laying off employees. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari, Nina Power, and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. This past week, the United Auto Workers have gone on strike. Trump has announced that he is skipping the second GOP debate, where the old pieties of the free market will be hymned by many candidates, and instead he's going to go appeal to union members in Michigan. Sohrab, we have published Michael Lind on our site about this. I know you follow this closely. What's the state of play with the 2024 race and the union vote?
Well, first of all, it's worth citing this fact, which I think I've mentioned on the podcast before. Certainly, we've mentioned it in the magazine itself. The margins in recent elections have been really tight. Something like a total of, several thousand votes in just a few kind of battleground states decided the outcome in 2016 for Trump and in 2020 for President Biden. So why does that matter? Well, it's because union households have been breaking remarkably for Trump over the past two election cycles. Still, the majority go for Democrats, but for a Republican nominee, he's been doing as well as any nominee since Ronald Reagan. So why that matters is that Trump can just pick off enough union households in just a few places like Wisconsin, Michigan, etc. He wins the election, even if other factors don't break as well for him. Right? It can tip him over to victory. So that's very important. And Michael Lind had an essay in Compact arguing that in 2024, the headline is Trump can still win the union vote. And the way that when he wrote it, in fact, before the strike was announced, that strike was still pending, but it hadn't gone forward. But the way he sort of described the state of play could not have been more prophetic in terms of what actually happened. He said that Trump and GOP populists would turn the discontent of the workers into a referendum on the Biden administration's green policies, the sort of drive to electrify the entire sort of automobile industry of the United States, and also in a way a referendum on the union leadership for failing to see that coming. And so in the coming days and weeks over this strike, you'll see, I think, the Trumpians and a few populist GOPers like Senator J.D. Vance and others try to kind of thread that needle in a way that is advantageous to the party in 2024, even if, as Lind concedes, and I think is correct, a Trump administration would not be the kind of administration that organized labor necessarily wants. It's very likely it'll be staffed by like more Scalia sons who are actually union busters, which is not a good thing. It's something that obviously we've decried, I've decried, but that they can do that because there's this weakness on the part of Democrats, right? Because they're torn between their NGO complex, which is very, very concerned with climate, and workers who, are manufacturing combustion engine vehicles and want to continue to be able to do that. That said, and I'll make this my last note, that all only goes so far. What's at stake in the current confrontation between the UAW and the big three automakers ultimately is not only, or not necessarily even primarily, electrification of American automobile manufacturing, but rather issues that are much more sort of humdrum bread and butter union issues like wages, two-tier contracts. I can explain what that is. Basically, there's like a generation of union workers that are grandfathered into these kind of more job secure, more retirement secure, more healthcare secure type contracts, but that subsequent workers who are coming in are being, put on these much more precarious, typical, lower wages, less benefits, et cetera. The reason that's a problem is ultimately it's even a problem for the older cohort because, as they hit retirement, if the next cohort isn't able to earn the way it used to and therefore contribute to pensions the way it used to, it can cause trouble for defined benefit pension plans. But also, there's an element of solidarity in there of older workers insisting that, their sons and their grandsons be able to get the same fair deal that they got out of the big three. We will see to what extent Trump, when he goes there, is able to address those issues as well, rather than making it entirely about greenification, which I think that ultimately, I think workers can see through that. That said, last point, I do think that, the UAW has tried to distance itself from any support from the right. I think it's a mistake. It's understandable because the Big Labour has gotten the back of the hand from the Republican Party for the better part of 2 generations. And so it's understandable that they're wary of the Republican Party. That said, it's not good for a labor movement to be so beholden to one political party, because then that political party can dictate a lot to it, as opposed to being independent as between the 2 parties. Having said all that, I do think that when he's on the ground, I suspect he'll be unbelievably popular among the workers who are actually there, like on the picket line. He'll be charming, is all I'll say. And it's very dangerous, I think, to President Biden and his reelection campaign.
Absolutely. As Michael Lind wrote in our pages, people have different sets of concerns. And if Republicans can basically make an appeal to people in terms of the interests of their industry, the GOP is always going to be more skeptical of the claims of labor than the Democrats, but they can say where we stand behind the internal combustion engine, we stand behind the way cars are made now. We don't favor this electrification campaign, which is moving manufacturing to right-to-work states. Brett Christophers, who we recently profiled in Compact, Dan Hitchens had a piece on Brett Christophers, has also pointed out how electrification has gone along with the great privatization. It's being done on different grounds than the Tennessee Valley Authority was, say, or the REA. These aren't really public works; these are private works. So there's a lot to be skeptical of in the electrification agenda, even beyond the fact that electric cars don't have range and often take very long time to charge. Trump, his trip to Michigan to appeal to the workers, I think, just in terms of the horse race politics, I want to spike the football here in the end zone and say, look, Sohrab and I, we wrote an op-ed saying Trump is the one for Compact. Trump, he's still the one. That was the title of the piece. We didn't make a kind of narrow electoral argument, but one of the kind of immediate responses to our piece was, well, Trump can't win. He can't win the general election. The notion that any of the other Republican candidates would do better in the upper Midwest than Trump is a fantasy. I don't think there's any way to suggest that any of the other Republican candidates would do as well in Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania.
Well, and indeed, if you look at the statements from many of them in recent days, they've really been basically arguing in favor of sort of aggressive union busting. The next debate is going to be held at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and they've been sort of harking back to Reagan's famous breaking of the air traffic controller strike as this great heroic stand against organized labor, and sort of, directly referencing that as what should be done against these pesky auto workers. You have sort of a handful of senators who I think are a little bit, sometimes seeming to bend over backwards to try to make this all about the electrification stuff and avoid the bread and butter issues Sohrab brought up. But, you do have at least a contingent who are breaking with the traditional anti-union stuff, but none of the other presidential candidates, as far as I can tell, are part of that contingent. They are basically saying the strike needs to be busted, these workers need to be fired. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, these Reagan hagiographers never really dwell much on the fact that Reagan himself could say, as a worker, ... Sohrab has written in our pages about the SAG strike, the Screen Actors Guild strike, and Reagan was not only a member of a labor union for actors, but in time its leader. So that's just something that I think is a little about Reagan. One of many facts about Reagan that's a little bit indigestible for today's Reaganites.
So we have an interesting parallel in Rishi Sunak is currently facing backlash over his perhaps leaked proposal to pull back on net zero, which is to do with these green policies, some of which would include banning petrol cars and oil boilers and this kind of thing. And net zero is sort of proposed for 2050. And it's very interesting, there's kind of permanent tension in politics between things that sort of need doing in the medium to long term, whether they actually do or not, right, based on scientific expertise, and the desire and indeed need of politicians and parties to be re-elected. So we have Sunak, who's a city boy, really, now posing as the kind of friend of workers and people everywhere who drive petrol cars, man of the people, and in a way saying that net zero is not achievable by 2050, and all of these kind of green proposals are in fact going to harm people, which of course they they inevitably will. At the same time, we have kind of a whole series of ongoing strikes, which we've mentioned on and off. At the moment, we have consultants on strike. So the kind of elite doctors in the UK who are currently on strike, much to many people's disgust and annoyance, including junior hospital staff who are having to rearrange outpatient appointments. And we have this ongoing crisis of infrastructure, as many countries in the West do. We have the looming prospect of a Labour government who are ostensibly more pro-union than the Tories. But I think it's interesting to just note on this, in this parallel way, the fact that Rishi Sunak is now currently posing as a friend of the average or working man and against the kind of green agenda, much to the disgust of many in his own party, actually, as well, it should be noted.
Speaking of endangered workers, Michelle Goldberg had quite interesting column in the New York Times titled, "Where Has All the Left-Wing Money Gone?" She describes big and small donors pulling back from their support of progressive organizations, things like the Sierra Club, the Justice Democrats, that's kind of the AOC, kind of young urban socialists group. So yeah, some political operatives are losing their jobs, as Goldberg notes, but this also seems kind of oddly timed given the looming threat of a Trump nomination in 2024. As we've been told many times, Trump is a fascist. He is a white supremacist. He is a racist. He's a misogynist. He's really a lot of bad things if you listen to our sober commentators. So shouldn't they put up a bit more of a fight? Why is this pullback happening now?
It's sort of a standard effect that when your party has the White House, people become more complacent. It's funny, she cites this kind of bizarre article from the New Republic that claims that all of America is traumatized. But, what I would say is I think that Goldberg hints at is the Trump years leading up to COVID and BLM and all of that. It did, I think, probably produce just this exhaustion among sort of Democratic partisans because they were constantly being told that we were in this existential crisis. Everything was a crisis. There were multiple crises happening at all times. You had to resist. You had to, not normalize the situation. I would guess that part of this is this kind of, even though I think this sort of America's traumatized rhetoric is quite silly, I would guess there is a kind of a cumulative exhaustion on the part of people who have been subject to this constant kind of sermonizing and, these constant kind of activist calls over the past 7 years, and that there is just this retreat, probably because you just can't keep up that level of kind of hysterical fever pitch catastrophizing for forever. Yeah, I'm guessing people are probably just kind of tired. And because I think the progressive side really can only operate in this way, and Goldberg kind of hints at this, that, because the overall vision is quite incoherent of what, positive things they would actually want. And instead, it's all about fending off some catastrophe, whether it be COVID or, police killings or climate change or just the threat of Trump. It's always framed in terms of, okay, we have to fight back against this existential threat that's going to destroy us all. Ultimately, I think is quite an exhausting way of doing politics. And I can see some of this, on a sort of happening around me. So that would be my theory as to what's going on. And I suppose the interesting thing to see will be, assuming there isn't some kind of successful lawfaring of Trump out of the nomination, there will be this face-off again next year. And, whether people can bring themselves to return to the level of Trump derangement syndrome that kind of motivated them for years previously is an interesting question.
So I'm going to float my theory, which is not in contradiction to Geoff's, but I think actually is complementary to what he just suggested, which is, we floated this theory at Compact, most notably with an essay that was widely discussed by the Columbia sociologist Musa Al-Gharbi, titled, the headline was, "Wokeism is Winding Down. It's Paywalled. So if you do want to read it, and you're listening to this, definitely, Google search that, Wokeism is Winding Down by Musa Al-Gharbi and subscribe. And the thesis is that kind of hyper hysterical progressivism actually peaked in 2020/2021 and has been on the wane ever since. I largely subscribe to this. I'm confronted with XYZ episode on Twitter when I see some bonkers like the left language policing itself and canceling someone over saying something slightly wrong or what have you. It throws a wrench into the cogs of this theory. But on the whole, I still think that it's more correct than not that something's happening on the center left where everyone's tired of that mode of progressivism, which, as Geoff said, the tone is hysterical. It always articulates itself over and against some emergency, whether it's looming Trumpian fascism or looming death of the planet or looming mass murder of African Americans by police officers. And there's not a positive vision in some ways, as it's always kind of in a kind of emergency mode that's exhausting. And they realize it, and you have a Biden administration, which I think has in some ways very smartly adopted many elements of the Trumpian critique of the neoliberal order by embracing tariffs and industrial policy and so on, while giving minor sops to the progressives, not enough on the actual big things that I think really matter. And some of the things are policies, we favor, like expanding, some sort of public option in healthcare or, a higher minimum wage, things like that. But it's done enough to like mollify both ends to emerge as a, kind of calm center left government in many ways. And so that combination of factors, what Geoff mentioned, the difficulty of sustaining the hysteria, what I suggest, which is that hysterical mode of politics actually has peaked and is on the wane now, with the Biden administration being kind of nimble in many ways ideologically, without delivering much for the left, but then, giving enough sops to them. That combination of forces has brought about this exhaustion of democratic donor generosity.
Yeah, I think just to add to what you've been saying, I think there is a limit to the extent to which people can also be made to feel guilty. And if we go with Nietzsche's etymology of guilt as a kind of debt, and if you think about something like BLM as almost like a kind of privatized or individualized form of reparations where white people are supposed to feel terrible and therefore sort of, individually try to restore justice through money whilst feeling terrible about being white. Meanwhile, BLM and many of these other groups are being identified with various modes of corruption and so on. I think people are not stupid. Like there's only a certain degree to which people can be asked for money and give it and feel guilty before realizing that nothing really is being done with the money, or indeed it's being kind of wasted or being kind of purloined even. And there was a kind of funny meme with Bernie Sanders kind of asking for money, which was sort of doing the rounds for a long time. And I think, it starts to look like a kind of grift, like, and precisely as you both said, it depends upon this kind of urgency. This, leftist activism is just about creating this sense of fear, really. And then I think a lot of people have grifted off of that kind of fear. And when it turned out that Trump wasn't putting, children in cages or whatever, or at least no more than any other president, then, that urgency lessens. And also the cost of living crisis, as we call it in the UK, people are probably thinking, I've given money, I wore my mask, I did everything the regime told me to. Why can I not just have a nice time and buy some expensive donuts and go on holiday? I've done with feeling guilty and, I need to save some money for my family. And that would be a totally reasonable attitude.
It's definitely true that there's that grifty element of the left, and the right has its own version. And all I will say is that the left version is a more prestige product. Like it's a nice product. You get a Times paper tracking COVID every day with really nice charts, as opposed to like, the right's version of it, which is, what do you call them, Matthew? Like donate now to get the Liberty doubloons. I love that expression. Anyway.
You're related to this story about the kind of drawdown and progressive support of NGOs. though it has its own element too, is the announcement that Ibram X Kendi's, Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University is laying off half of its employees. There's an article in the Boston Globe that broke the news by Nick Stoico. BU Center for Anti-Racist Research lays off staff members. What's going on here?
I think it's an interesting illustration of a sort of problem facing academia in general, which is once you've kind of defined your mission as activism primarily, you can kind of create something that has the trappings of what looks like a sort of academic institute. But, in fact, and again, I don't have the inside story here, but, I think there is a kind of question of mission that, you have this institute that, is created in the midst of the sort of 2020 social ferment around Black Lives Matter. And, you have Jack Dorsey giving $10 million to Boston University, so it's kind of this flashy bit of philanthropy that's done to advertise, as everyone was trying to do, a kind of commitment to this social and political mission. But then there's just a question of what the purpose of such an entity is going to be. Basically, it seems to be defined in its mission by this, relatively narrow set of doctrines elaborated by Ibram X Kendi. Can it actually function like is it really an academic research institution? Is it more of a kind of activist NGO? Like, what is it other than this kind of accrual of prestige that once universities can't define themselves through their sort of more traditional missions and have to find other ways of understanding their animating purpose, that they can sort of attach these institutes to themselves as kind of a way of advertising that. What actually is being done here? Like, what is it? Is it fundamentally activism? Is it fundamentally research? Historically, a research institute would be kind of dedicated to a particular area. But if it's anti-racist research, that means that it's, really limited to elaborating the particular theory of this one person. It's a little unclear what exactly that amounts to. And so I think it's not surprising that such an institute would face crisis quickly because of the vagueness of its mandate and the way that it kind of attempts to commingle activism and academic research in a way that ultimately seems quite incoherent.
Yeah, people should just fund history, and including the history of race, but proper kind of serious historiography, and potentially could lead to positive social change, as an incidental effect rather than whatever hybrid of activism and academe that Geoff described as.
And I would say Kendi's first book, Stamped from the Beginning, its argument is reasonably interesting. And, it's an argument that's congruent with ones made by, people like Barbara and Karen Fields, that sort of racial categories are invented to legitimize a particular kind of regime of labor exploitation, right, that emerges in the American colonies. And so it is, it has a serious historical thesis, and it's at least kind of, it's a legitimate sort of academic project. But then he pivots to this how to be an anti-racist, which is ultimately a kind of, self-help, more of a kind of self-help book, and, one that kind of goes along with this ballooning kind of DEI consulting industry. It provides one of the kind of, textbooks for various kinds of DEI consulting. So he himself kind of undergoes this pivot from being essentially somebody who does historical academic research to somebody who's primarily engaged in this kind of activist / consultancy type project. The other thing that's worth noting about this book, I think it does kind of indicate Richard Hanania's understanding of the origins of woke, as he calls it, which is that, it's essentially just a kind of ideological elaboration of certain kind of weird ideas that are baked into civil rights law. Initially is devised to solve a particular problem, the particular oppressive regime facing blacks, primarily in the U.S. South. But as its mandate expands, it becomes this project of, wherever you see any kind of racial or gender disparity, you have have to aggressively attempt to correct it. And so this is kind of the logic by which this legal regime has been operating for decades without necessarily having a clear kind of moral vision animating it, other than the original kind of moral impetus behind the Civil Rights Act, which still, I think, commands vast majority support. But, once it kind of accomplishes its initial mission, it has this kind of mission creep into other areas. And, so I think Kendi's model of anti-racism, which is basically that anyone that creates or enables any kind of disparity to emerge is essentially just a kind of elaborate ideological justification for this very broad application of kind of civil rights law ideas. So, I think that sort of explains the traction that it got immediately is basically that it provides a kind of legitimating ideology for a set of practices that were already being implemented in all sorts of ways for decades.
Yeah, I think on the Kendi story of exploitation, I mean, the phrase that came to mind when I was reading it was meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And I think there is no way in which one is protected simply by virtue of saying that, well, one is virtuous according to the criteria of the current regime. And what's sort of amusing about part of this story is the almost like the victim culture clash of, on the one hand, the kind of race grifting, and then the academics. And nobody can complain as much as academics about exploitative workload. So I think Chris Rufo, who's of course written for Compact quite recently, had a very interesting tweet insight into this aspect, where he was saying that the academics are using this language of exploitation and that they've been worked so hard, and yet they really have produced no research. I mean, partly I think precisely for the reasons Geoff was saying, that there's no real mandate, and as Sohrab says, they're not doing historical research. They're not even doing kind of classical academic work. What are they doing? They're potentially just producing more kind of ideological fodder for a position that's already been predetermined, and this is in no way a research of any worth. So perhaps it's not really surprising that people have not produced anything and yet managed to complain about their workload nevertheless. So I was kind of amused by this sort of culture clash of various kinds of victimhood that are swirling around the story. We'll see if it persists at all as a centre, whether it will simply fade into the night.
Well, with that, thanks to Sohrab, Nina, and Geoff, and thanks to you listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe.